The Mandalorians have become one of the most visible parts of the Star Wars landscape in recent years, thanks largely to the runaway success of the Baby Yoda show and its starring Mandalorian character. But, as any good Star Wars fan knows, and probably a lot of the evil ones too, Mandalorians have been around for a while, and their current popularity owes a debt of decades to what came before. The earliest version of what would become a Mandalorian warrior was actually Darth Vader. In the second draft of A New Hope, the Sith originated as a group of pirates that learned to use the dark side of the Force, and Darth Vader was their frightening, masked leader. As the story evolved and Vader became a former Jedi, the mercenary background of the Sith also fell away, and George Lucas reused the idea in the sequel, with Boba Fett filling the role of a striking, anonymous mercenary. But before the character even had a name, he had a look. Early in the development of The Empire Strikes Back, artists Ralph McQuarrie and Joe Johnston were tasked with designing a new Imperial Super Trooper, but toy company Kenner and Lucasfilm's merchandising arm wanted a new toy that could be released ahead of the film and appear in the upcoming holiday special. So the process was fast-tracked and the armor was given to a new mercenary character called Boba Fett. The initial white prototype costume was built based on its Super Trooper origin and then painted later by Joe Johnston, and it made its first public appearance at a San Anselmo parade in September of 1978. But at this point, Fett was still just some guy, and his connection to any larger society or culture wouldn't happen until a year later in 1979, when a newsletter from Lucasfilm's official Star Wars fan club told fans that he wears part of the uniform of the Imperial Shock Troopers, warriors from the olden time. Shock Troopers came from the far side of the galaxy, and there aren't many of them left. They were wiped out by the Jedi Knights during the Clone Wars. This backstory also appeared in the novelization of The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, though the mention of Imperial Shock Troopers was removed, and instead Boba Fett's armor just came from a group of evil warriors. The Empire Strikes Back sketchbook, also published in 1980, would then name these evil warriors' home star system as Mandalore. And following the movie, where Fett was depicted as little more than the most dangerous of a group of bounty hunters hired by Darth Vader to track the Millennium Falcon, the next outing for the Mandalorians would be in 1982, when the Star Wars comic books published by Marvel included a Boba Fett look-alike named Fen Shisa, who is leading a resistance on Mandalore to free the world from Imperial-aligned slavers that had taken over the planet while its warriors were away fighting. But being a very early entry in the Star Wars expanded universe, the timeline was a little wonky. According to Fen, when the Empire rose to power during the Clone Wars, the government of Mandalore sent 212 super commandos to fight on Palpatine's behalf, with Fen being briefed about enemies of the Empire like Princess Leia. By the end of the war, only 3 Mandalorians survived: Fen, his friend Tabi Dalla, and their chief officer Boba Fett, who became disenchanted with fighting for other people and left to become a bounty hunter, a profession where you exclusively fight for other people. Despite actually telling us a fair bit about Mandalore and even showing a glimpse of a Mandalorian society, these Marvel comics were kind of ignored by the wider Star Wars universe for a long time, and Lucasfilm largely disregarded them when planning newer expanded universe stories. When a structured hierarchy for the expanded universe was created in 2000, the Marvel comics and other early tales that predated an attempt to create a cohesive universe were referred to as secondary canon, material that was available for authors to reference or use if needed, but shouldn't take precedence over more modern stories. So, with the Marvel comics being relegated to the backrooms of Star Wars continuity, the Mandalorians remained mysterious, and Boba Fett's explicit connection to them was left vague, with most sources in the 80s and 90s only saying that he wore the armor of the Mandalorians rather than outright saying he was one. And even when the Star Wars tabletop role-playing game introduced Jodo Kast as another bounty hunter wearing Mandalorian armor, the source of his gear also remained unknown. There would be a few other references to the Mandalorians here and there, like West End Games' 1989 Imperial Sourcebook claiming that the visored helmets of the Imperial Royal Guards were inspired by the Death Watch of the Mandalore system, or a 1992 issue of the Dark Empire comic miniseries, which featured a Mandalorian-made dungeon ship that had previously been used to transport Jedi during the Clone Wars. But the first real expansion of Mandalorian lore wouldn't happen until 1995, when the Tales of the Jedi series included ancient Mandalorians in a story set 4,000 years before the events of the films. The opening pages of the Sith War storyline established the ancient Mandalorians as crusaders without a crusade, a collection of warrior clans who, far from their homeworld, waged war for personal honor rather than for money or power. Their leader, who was also called Mandalore, even appeared to be driven by a subconscious desire to conquer. They fight because this is the way. The Mandalorians in Tales of the Jedi weren't just a massive army that beat their enemy through sheer numbers, and the comic established the cultural importance of single combat. As the Mandalorians waged war against a star system they hoped to conquer, Mandalore challenged Ulic Qel-Droma, the system's Jedi protector and recently risen Sith Lord, to a one-on-one battle. If Ulic won, then the Mandalorians would serve him. If Mandalore won, then his warriors would take possession of the star system. Ulic defeated Mandalore, but he and his warriors stayed true to their word. They served the Sith Lord just as Boba Fett served Darth Vader, though in true Star Wars fashion, good triumphed over evil and the Mandalorians were defeated by the combined forces of the Republic and the Beast Riders of Onderon. Mandalore himself was shot down, crashed into Onderon's moon, and then was devoured by beasts, with only his mask left behind to be recovered by one of his alien warriors who declared himself the new Mandalore. Another comic in 1995 also dropped the first bit of lore about Boba Fett's backstory, with the Dark Empire 2 miniseries mentioning that Fett used to be an Imperial stormtrooper who'd killed his commanding officer. After these comics, 1996 added another piece to the Mandalorian puzzle with the release of the short story collection Tales of the Bounty Hunters. In the book's story about Boba Fett, the mysterious bounty hunter was revealed to not be Boba Fett at all. In truth, his original name was Jaster Muriel, a journeyman protector from the planet Concord Dawn who assumed the Fett name as an alias after killing a superior officer and being exiled. The story also included a line about Fett briefly being a stormtrooper, which aligned with Dark Empire's version of his backstory, though his time as a stormtrooper and his killing of a superior officer were now unrelated events. It wasn't much, but it seemed to indicate that whatever or whoever he was, Fett was not a Mandalorian, and however he got his armor remained a mystery for another 6 years. 2002's Attack of the Clones was a major pivot point for the Mandalorians. Their official backstory claimed that they'd been wiped out by the Jedi during the Clone Wars, an era that was off limits for expanded universe authors prior to the release of the prequel trilogy. But when the middle chapter revealed that Boba Fett was the clone son of Jango Fett, who himself was the template for the Republic's clone army, all bets were off. Boba and Jango and the Mandalorians were able to be explored fully without any worry about potentially contradicting George Lucas's future plans for the character, though the Jaster Muriel and ex-Stormtrooper backstories had seemingly been obliterated. But why include the Fetts at all? According to George Lucas on the movie's DVD commentary, in his mind, the Stormtroopers had always been clones, and he'd always imagined that Boba had been one of these troops who'd broken away to forge his own path. But is this true? Maybe? Kind of? It certainly lines up with Fett's backstory in Dark Empire and Tales of the Bounty Hunters, but George Lucas has a tendency to revise history when it comes to what he was thinking during the development of the Star Wars saga, even going so far as to modify J.W. Rinsler's 2007 Making of Star Wars book to include a mention of midi-chlorians so that his initial words about the wider Star Wars universe would be more in line with his later thoughts. And in the DVD commentary for Return of the Jedi, Lucas lamented giving Fett such an ignoble death, saying that back in the 80s, Fett was just another bad guy, and he would have made the character's death more exciting if he'd known how popular he would become. So it doesn't really seem like Lucas was putting too much thought into who Boba Fett was under the helmet back then. But there is some evidence that he wasn't just making up the connection after the fact. Despite most expanded universe stories depicting stormtroopers as just regular people, an issue of the Star Wars Official Poster Monthly magazine from 1978 included an article that stated right up front that stormtroopers were clones. And while this could be just an early publication making a wild guess that turned out to hit the mark decades later, another issue of the magazine was the first place to reveal that Darth Vader had received his injuries after falling into a volcano during a duel with Obi-Wan Kenobi. They clearly had some access to Lucas's thoughts and ideas about the Star Wars universe that weren't public knowledge, and I think the clone thing might have been one of them. And from a production standpoint at least, Boba Fett did originate as a design for a stormtrooper that broke away and became its own character. It's not too much of a stretch to imagine that Lucas could have accepted that as Fett's in-universe backstory as well, especially if he was only supposed to be a minor character that didn't need anything overly complex. So I think he was telling the truth. This was always Boba Fett's backstory, from a certain point of view. But regardless of why Fett was in the movie, his inclusion also meant that authors could tell tie-in stories about the character, such as the Jango Fett Open Seasons comic miniseries, which gave fans their first real look at a modern Mandalorian society. Decades before the events of The Phantom Menace, the Mandalorian mercenaries had splintered, with the Death Watch, mentioned in the Imperial sourcebook, instigating a civil war under the leadership of a man called Vizsla, who believed that the Mandalorians should attempt to conquer the galaxy. Leading the opposition against Vizsla was Jaster Muriel, now reinterpreted as a separate character from Boba Fett, though retaining the same backstory about being exiled after killing his superior officer. To tie things together further, after his exile, Muriel's old job of Journeyman Protector was taken up by Jango Fett's father, at least until he and the rest of Jango's family was killed by Death Watch during the Mandalorian Civil War. Jango, as the sole survivor, was then adopted by the Mandalorians, and Jaster became his mentor. The Civil War continued during Jango's youth, though Death Watch seemed to be on the winning side. Jango rose to become the leader of the Mandalorians after Jaster's death during a Death Watch ambush, and years later, Jango's group was wiped out by a Jedi strike team led by Count Dooku. With Jango being the last one standing, once again, it seemed like the Mandalorian Civil War had been decided in favor of Death Watch, until Fett returned to exact his revenge, destroying the Death Watch ship and killing Vizsla. When it came time for Dooku and Darth Sidious to find a genetic template for the clone army being developed by the Kaminoans, Dooku remembered the battle against the Mandalorians and the heavy Jedi casualties inflicted by them, and he sought Fett out to serve as the donor. Though the Bounty Hunter video game that came out around the same time as Open Seasons elaborated that Fett wasn't the only Mandalorian that Dooku had his eye on, and he engineered a competition between Fett and a former colleague named Montross, who'd left the Mandalorians when Jango was made the group's leader. And of course, Jango inevitably met his own end at the hands of Mace Windu during the events of Attack of the Clones. So, in a very roundabout way, that original lore about the Jedi Knights wiping out the Mandalorians during the Clone War was still true, though by the time it happened, they were only kind of down to one guy. But now, thanks to his father's backstory, Boba Fett was treated as a true Mandalorian, and in 2003 was even featured in a comic trying to rebuild the Mandalorian Protectors as a mercenary group during the Yuuzhan Vong War. 2003 also saw the release of Knights of the Old Republic, which took place 40 years after the last sighting of the Mandalorians in Tales of the Jedi. The game featured a number of Mandalorians as enemies, with their armor resembling that of the Imperial Royal Guards, another callback to the Imperial sourcebook. The game also included Mandalorian mercenary Canderous Ordo as a party member, and him, along with the enemy Mandalorians, were veterans of the newly created Mandalorian Wars, a large-scale galactic conflict that saw the Mandalorians launch a failed attempt to conquer the Republic. Through the player's conversations with Canderous, the game offered deeper insights into Mandalorian culture. The idea of Mandalorians fighting for honor was retained from Tales of the Jedi, as was their connection to the Sith, who the game implied had influenced the Mandalorians to start their war in the first place. Their fairly basic philosophy was also shaded in with the idea that Mandalorians were driven to battle as a form of self-improvement, to test themselves against impossible odds and come out on top. Even a losing battle was worthwhile to them if it meant that the fight would be remembered by history, and they respected anyone who managed to defeat them. But KOTOR's Mandalorians also had the sorts of contradictions and drawbacks that you might find in real-world societies and ideologies. While they valued honor, they could sometimes be blinded by it, like Canderous leaving some of his men to die during a battle so he could have the personal honor of defeating an enemy leader himself. Canderous was also not against attacking civilians, and he blamed the Republic for having soldiers in the same areas as non-combatants in the first place. To the Mandalorians, those who can defend themselves shouldn't be anywhere near those who can't. Canderous was also a little remorseful of the war, not because of his own actions, but because of how much it had hurt his people. Their desire to fight was so great that they didn't realize how much the battle would cost them until it was over. And Canderous regretted that much of the Mandalorian diaspora had resorted to becoming dishonorable bandits in a vain attempt to recapture their former glory. The game's 2004 sequel saw Canderous acting on that regret. After recovering the ancient mask of Mandalore, he began reuniting the scattered Mandalorian clans on the moon of Onderon. But it wasn't just for the glory of his people this time. After the events of the first game, the player character disappeared into the unknown regions to investigate an ancient Sith threat, and he charged Canderous with rebuilding the Mandalorians to help fight it in an upcoming sequel. The sequel didn't happen, but that doesn't mean the Mandalorians dropped off the map. In 2005, a couple of months before Revenge of the Sith hit theaters, the Republic Commando video game became the next major milestone in the history of the Mandalorians, even if it didn't have all that much to do with them. The game itself was bereft of any explicit mention of the Mandalorians. You played as a squad of Jango's clones, but they were treated as Republic soldiers first and foremost. It was actually the game's soundtrack, composed by Jesse Harlan, that connected the characters to their Mandalorian roots. With the clones being the predecessors to the Empire's stormtroopers, Harlan wanted to connect the game's characters to the Emperor, and he decided to reference the Emperor's choral theme from Return of the Jedi and the prequels with a Soviet-inspired choral anthem for the clones. The game's lyrics formed the basis of a new Mandalorian language, with some of it being created by Harlan and some pieces coming from an in-universe alien poem written by Star Wars sound designer Ben Burtt that had been featured in the soundtrack of 1996's Shadows of the Empire. The liner notes for the Shadows soundtrack said that the poem was about an ancient battle that took place on prehistoric Coruscant when its indigenous species was invaded by a race called the Towns. The fledgling Mandalorian language was also picked up by Republic Commando's tie-in novel written by Karen Travis and published about 4 months before the release of the game. This early release of the novel also meant that the connection to Shadows of the Empire could be noticed by Abel G. Pena, who in early 2005 wrote an article for the Star Wars Insider magazine detailing a comprehensive in-universe history of the Mandalorians. In Pena's article, the towns referenced by the lyrics from Shadows of the Empire were said to be the ancient precursors to the Mandalorians, and the alien warriors seen in the Tales of the Jedi comics were the last remnants of the Taung species. The name Mandalore, then, came from an ancient warrior known as Mandalore I, with later Taung leaders taking his name as a title. The name of their leader also became the name of their homeworld, with Mandalore not being a specific planet, but just whatever world their current leader called home, which also ties into the nomadic depiction of Mandalorians from Tales of the Jedi. Eventually, the Mandalorians did settle on a single world to call home, though, one that was home to the Mythosaurs, a new alien species inspired by an ancient skeleton glimpsed in the Marvel comics and now said to resemble the skull crest on Boba Fett's armor. The early mentions of Mandalorians being crusaders without a crusade also tied in with the way the article transitioned them from the alien Taungs to the mostly human Mandalorians we'd see later. The warrior who picked up Mandalore's mask in Tales of the Jedi would turn out to have been the last Mandalorian leader with Taung blood, and the war had been so devastating that the Mandalorians had to bolster their ranks by allowing converts and conscripts from other species. By the time that last Taung Mandalore died, the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders had been so successful that they ensured the survival of their culture, if not their bloodline, for millennia to come. The article also had a way to tidy up the appearance of the Mandalorians in the old Marvel comics. Since Boba Fett was now a kid during the Clone Wars, Pena came up with a character called Spar, an ARC trooper who had somehow inherited Jango's memories in addition to his genetics. Spar found a way off Kamino before the start of the Clone Wars, and after learning about the real Jango's death, decided his purpose was to resurrect the Mandalorian Super Commandos. And it turned out that it was Spar, not Boba, who led Mandalore's 212 warriors during the Clone Wars. And with the true Mandalorians being wiped out years earlier by the Jedi, Spar had to scrape together his forces from former Death Watch members as well as police officers and journeyman protectors from worlds around Mandalore. Among those recruited by Spar was Fen Shaisa, and it turns out he was probably just mistaken about which of Jango's clones had been his leader. Other minor characters wearing Mandalorian armor were also recontextualized in this article. Boba Fett impersonator Jodo Kast was revealed to have gotten his armor from Fesket Bob, a character who was introduced in a Star Wars miniatures battle scenario and retconned to have been a member of Fenn's fledgling Mandalorian organization. Even the seemingly impossible-to-be canon story of Fett's past as Jaster Muriel was referenced, now with the implication that Muriel was an alias Fett adopted at some point during his youth before he became an infamous bounty hunter. As for what happened to Spar, well, it turns out he was killed by Boba Fett's daughter. You knew Boba Fett had a daughter, didn't you? In 2001, the dubiously canonical Star Wars Tales comic series published a story that showed Boba Fett as a father. This story was then used as a jumping-off point by Peña's article to create Aelin Vel, Boba Fett's estranged daughter, who blamed him for her mother's death after he abandoned their family and attempted to hunt him down during her adulthood. Mistaking Spar for her father, Aelin tracked him, killed him, and took his armor for herself, masquerading as Boba Fett to cash in on his reputation. She eventually realized she'd gotten the wrong guy and Fett was still alive, so she tracked him to a remote planet where she found one of Fett's ships abandoned near a mangled corpse wearing Mandalorian armor. Assuming that this too was her father, it wasn't, it was Fen Shaisa, Vel took the ship and continued to masquerade as Fett. Mostly so that previous appearances by Fett in the expanded universe where he'd acted out of character could be retconned as not actually being him. And aside from these sorts of janitorial efforts, Peña's article also made a major new contribution to Mandalorian lore, with the introduction of Mandalorian iron, a rare metal created by Mandalorian smiths that's nearly indestructible. The article even suggested that one of Darth Vader's gloves was laced with the material, to explain how he could use it to deflect shots from a blaster, or how it could survive the destruction of the Death Star to become a MacGuffin in a series of kids' books. But despite all of Peña's work, his article wasn't the only thing shaping Mandalorian history during the 2000s, because the future of the Mandalorians was being written by Karen Traviss. After the success of Hard Contact, Traviss continued to write Republic Commando books and reframed the soldiers of the Republic's Grand Army as the next generation of Mandalorian warriors. In these stories, 75 of the 100 combat trainers that had been handpicked by Jango Fett to teach the clone army were Mandalorians who'd managed to avoid the slaughter on Galadran and brought along their culture in addition to their tactics. Through the clones and their instructors, particularly Omega Squad and their instructor Cal Scarata, the Mandalorian point of view was given the spotlight, and their language, customs, and even food were explored in greater detail than ever before. Using the works of previous authors as a jumping-off point, the Mandalorians' nomadic nature and the adoption of different species into their ranks became core elements of their society, and Travis's version of Mandalorian culture valued adoption and found family, with the lack of a common home or bloodline meaning that the Mandalorians' warrior culture became the glue that held their society together. Their nomadic nature also influenced their reputation as a group of mercenaries, with no particular attachment to the planet that bore their name and therefore no land or property to defend. Their martial ways needed other outlets, and that meant fighting for other people. Traviss also outlined details about Mandalorian family life, gender roles, their views on religion, and the meanings associated with the various colors and symbols that decorate their armor, which was now said to be made of Beskar, the Mandoa term for Mandalorian iron. Traviss was also able to demonstrate her vision of a Mandalorian society in the Legacy of the Force novel series, which was published alongside her Republic Commando books. In these stories, which were set 35 years after the original trilogy, a new Star War was brewing, and Boba Fett, having fully claimed the title of Mandalore after reassembling the Protectors during the Yuuzhan Vong War, had to figure out how his people were going to get involved, if at all. And Fett felt very out of place as a leader. His connection to Mandalorian culture died with his father, and he viewed his homeworld as Kamino, not the planet where Mandalorian farmers and metalsmiths had continued to eke out a living in his absence. Fett didn't speak the language, he barely understood the customs, and he'd only taken up the mantle at the urging of a dying Fen Shaisa. As a result, Fett had a fairly mercenary opinion about the whole war situation. The conflict had nothing to do with the Mandalorians, and they had nothing to gain as a society by getting involved. So he decided that Mandalore as a world would stay out of it. Any individual Mandalorians who wanted to sell their services would be allowed to do so, but they couldn't do it in Mandalore's name. However, the Imperial occupation of Mandalore from the Marvel Comics was still in living memory, and the war against the Yuuzhan Vong had cost the planet 1.5 million people, a third of its total population, and there were roughly 9 million members of the nomadic Mandalorian diaspora scattered around the galaxy. So a growing Mandalore First movement, led by the grown son of one of Travis's clone commando characters, didn't want to see the Mandalorians forced to fight each other on the battlefield to survive while their homeworld rotted away from neglect and the ravages of war. They wanted to consolidate power in their sector and turn Mandalore into a fortified home base, so that the Mandalorians would be self-sufficient enough to fight because they wanted to, not because they had to. So Fett agreed to put out a call for 2 million Mandalorians to return home to help rebuild the planet. And that number, 2 million, shows just how far the Mandalorians had shifted in only a few years. What was initially depicted as a small group of mysterious warriors that had died out decades earlier was now a society with millions of members. That's certainly tiny on a galactic scale, but it meant that the previously devastating Mandalorian Civil War was now reframed as a factional squabble between two mercenary groups, and the Mandalorians' extinction at the hands of the Jedi during the Clone Wars now just referred to a particular figurehead meeting his end during the war's opening battle. And aside from just increasing the size of their society, she also increased the Mandalorians' influence on the galaxy. Characters with no connection to Mandalore would frequently reference Mandalorian customs, like Luke Skywalker's son, not only knowing about Mandalorian coming-of-age rituals, but actively envying Mandalorian children who got to achieve the power fantasy of being a cool jetpack Iron Man guy long before he would be able to attain the power fantasy of being a lightsaber-wielding Jedi Knight. And the Mandalorians' perception of the Jedi was also elaborated on in Travis's stories, with many of their criticisms echoing real-world criticisms that fans had made about the prequel-era Jedi. So despite only having a 5-year tenure writing for Star Wars, a shorter lifespan than Boba Fett's Jaster Muriel backstory, a lot of the things Travis was doing made her version of the Mandalorians very popular with fans. They could learn the Mandalorian language, they could live by the Mandalorian creeds, they could imbue meaning into the color of their cosplays, and fans' frustrations with how the Jedi were depicted in the prequels were not only shared by the Mandalorians, but validated by Jedi agreeing with them and leaving the Jedi to join the clans. But even when Travis was the dominant voice in Mandalorian storytelling, she wasn't the only one doing it. Alongside the evolution of modern Mandalorian society depicted in Legacy of the Force, the concurrently running Knights of the Old Republic comic book series by John Jackson Miller went back in time to tell the stories set during the Mandalorian Wars referenced by Canderous in the video game. As you might guess by the title, these comics tended to favor the Jedi side of the story, and the primary Mandalorian character, Roland Dyer, was a deserter who wasn't satisfied with his superior's answers for why his people went to war. Roland never actually got an answer due to the comic replacing him with an impersonator for much of his run, but the readers already knew back in 2003 that the Mandalorians had been egged on by the Sith. At the same time, all the way on the other end of the timeline, another comic series called Legacy showed readers a glimpse of what Mandalorians would be like nearly 140 years after the events of the original trilogy. In that era, the Mandalorians remained mercenaries for hire, but the current Mandalore had been betrayed and usurped by someone who was under orders from a mysterious master to keep the Mandalorians from getting involved in the latest Star Wars. Unfortunately, the comic ended before the usurper could be brought to justice, and that's as far as the Legends timeline ever got with the Mandalorians. Because, for all the work that authors like Travis and Miller and Pena had done to shape a mishmash of minor references and brief appearances into a cohesive, fleshed-out society, they were still playing in someone else's sandbox. And in 2010, George Lucas wanted his toys back. At Lucas's request, the Mandalorians appeared in the second season of the Clone Wars cartoon, and under his direction they were reimagined as a peaceful society who had abandoned their ancient warlike ways, and those who still wished to fight were exiled to Mandalore's moon, Concordia. And those warriors were specifically designed to wear identical anonymous armor rather than highly personalized and meaningful gear. The show even went as far as to have a character claim that Jango Fett had no connection to the Mandalorians whatsoever, something that raised the eyebrows of longtime fans. And one of those fans was the show's supervising director, Dave Filoni, who made Lucas aware of the wealth of material that had already been written about the Mandalorians and tried to salvage as much as he could. The ancient history of the Mandalorians, seen in the comics and video games, was still valid and was what Mandalore's exiled warriors wanted their society to return to. In more modern times, a version of the Mandalorian Civil War still happened, and the antagonistic Death Watch was still led by a man named Vizsla, and like in the Legacy of the Force series, Mandalore's surface had been ravaged by war, and a faction of Mandalorians rose to prominence who wanted their society to be about more than just killing people for money, with the planet officially remaining neutral in a war. But there were also a lot of changes which made the new canonical version of Mandalorians very hard to reconcile with what came before. What a Mandalorian even was altered by the show. Instead of a Mandalorian being anyone of any species who chose to wear the armor and live by Mandalorian rules, the new Mandalore was an ethno-state populated almost entirely by blonde-haired, blue-eyed humans. Instead of a loose collection of largely ungoverned nomads, the new Mandalore had a prime minister and a duchess, and instead of Mandalore's mask being the sign of leadership, It was a weapon called the Darksaber, an ancient black-bladed lightsaber forged by a rare Mandalorian-born Jedi and now wielded by Death Watch leader Pre Vizsla. Vizsla saw himself as, essentially, the inheritor of that pre-Clone Wars version of the Mandalorians and hated the pacifistic direction of his society as much as some of the fans did. Vizsla's determination to return Mandalore to its ancient roots eventually saw him teaming up with the Duchess Satine Kryze's traitorous sister Bo-Katan, and eventually Darth Maul, in order to take leadership of the planet. And although he was successful, his victory was short-lived as Maul challenged him to a battle for leadership, just as the ancient Mandalore had battled Ulic Qel-Droma. Vizsla lost not only his title, but his life. But Maul wasn't a Mandalorian, and Bo-Katan was unwilling to follow an outsider, so she turned against him, and after the death of her sister became the leader of the Mandalorian resistance against Maul, and was even willing to accept a Republic invasion of her planet in order to get him off the throne. There were plans to continue this storyline and eventually depict how Maul would be ousted from Mandalore, but those had to be put on hold when George Lucas sold Lucasfilm to Disney in 2012, right in the middle of the show's Mandalore-heavy 5th season. And that also made the expanded universe's attempts to reconcile this latest version of the Mandalorians with what came before feel a little bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. In 2013, the Bounty Hunter's Code from the files of Boba Fett attempted to make everything fit together. Presented as an in-universe document, the book reframed the Mandalorian development of the 2000s as secret knowledge that the pacifist new Mandalorian government had tried to cover up. The Mandalorian Civil War was now depicted as a three-way struggle between the violent Death Watch, the pacifistic new Mandalorians, and Jaster Mareel's true Mandalorian faction right in the middle. The Darksaber was chosen by Death Watch as an alternative sign of leadership to Mandalore's mask, and the faction was led by their own secret Mandalores in opposition to the true Mandalore, Jaster Mareel. Tor Vizsla, the segment's author, even continued to use the pseudo-religious language that established the Mandalorians as crusaders all the way back in Tales of the Jedi, and referred to the Mandalorian Civil War as a struggle between the Death Watch faithful and the other faithless Mandalorian factions. But with Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm, the Star Wars slate was wiped clean in anticipation of the upcoming sequel trilogy, and only the 7 theatrically released Star Wars films and the Clone Wars television show would be treated as fully canonical moving forward. Though the older expanded universe material, now referred to as the Legends continuity, could still be drawn from by new Star Wars storytellers, in the same way those old Marvel comics had been treated as secondary material. However, there was still one last holdout. One story keeping the lights on for the Legends continuity: The Old Republic. Launched at the end of 2011, the Old Republic MMO was in its infancy during the sale to Disney, but it's continued to release expansions and updates ever since. The game's base story is set about 300 years after the first 2 KOTOR games and is divided between the Republic and the Sith Empire, with each faction having 4 individual class storylines that players can follow. The Bounty Hunter story intersects the most with the Mandalorians. The player not only gets a Mandalorian party member, but they have the opportunity to become a Mandalorian themselves, inducted into the group by the current Mandalore to serve as his replacement on a secretive roster of bounty hunters so that he can lead the Mandalorian war effort against the Republic. But neither the player character or Mandalore the Vindicated are major characters in the game overall story. Instead, that honor goes to Shae Vizsla. Presumably an ancient relative of the other Vizslas we've seen, Shae's glossy lips were part of the game's very first cinematic trailer in 2009, though she didn't appear in-game until the Shadow of Revan expansion in 2014, first as a Flashpoint boss and then as a quest giver. When the game did a 5-year time skip for the Knights of the Fallen Empire expansion, the Mandalore from the base game had died, and Shae had replaced him, with the player needing to recruit her and her Mandalorians into the war effort against the new baddies. Most recently, Shae's leadership has been challenged by the emergence of the Hidden Chain, a faction of Mandalorians who share similar beliefs to the Mandalore First Movement from Legacy of the Force, that Mandalorians shouldn't act as mercenaries working for others and should fight to further the causes of Mandalore instead. Since the game is still getting updates, the story is still ongoing, and when it finishes, it'll likely be the last word on the Mandalorians in the Legends continuity. As for the new stuff, The first story of the Disney era to feature Mandalorians was Star Wars Rebels, which premiered in 2014 and featured the Mandalorian Sabine Wren as a main character. Sabine, it turned out, was a member of a clan that was under House Vizsla, and her mother had been a member of Death Watch during the Clone Wars. And thanks to the new Mandalorians' pacifist society dying with Duchess Satine, these more martial Mandalorians were all that existed. Although the resolution of the storyline hadn't been told, it was clear that Mandalore didn't return to its peaceful ways after Maul was ousted. However, that happened. The Mandalorian story in Rebels also introduced Imperial Super Commandos, Mandalorian warriors who had joined the Empire and wore armor inspired by the early designs that would eventually become Boba Fett. The Super Commandos were opposed by a heroic group of Mandalorians known as the Journeyman Protectors of Concord Dawn, who were led by Fen Rao. Names that nod to earlier Mandalorian lore, even if the story can't incorporate them fully. The addition of other Mandalorian worlds like Concord Dawn or Sabine's home on Cronest also allowed the Mandalorians to diversify. While the Mandalorian ethno-state was still human, they were finally humans who didn't all look alike. Beskar also made its reappearance in Rebels as the element targeted by an Imperial weapon specifically designed to kill Mandalorians, which had been created by Sabine during her time at the Imperial Academy. And of course, the Darksaber reappeared as well, discovered on Dathomir among Maul's possessions, neatly sidestepping having to deal with what exactly would have happened in those unproduced episodes of the Clone Wars. And while the weapon was used by Sabine for a while, she eventually returned it to Bo-Katan, who became the new leader of the Mandalorian people. By the time Rebels ended in 2018, the Mandalorians had started to balance quite a bit more towards the Legends version of their society. They were more nomadic, scattered around the galaxy, and while certain clans or groups still had similar looks, Sabine had heavily personalized armor, and the identical armor of the Imperial Super Commandos helped to mark them as the bad guys. And that return to the expanded universe version of Mandalorians would continue with the debut of the 2019 Disney Plus show, The Mandalorian. In 2017, filmmaker and the voice of Pre Vizsla, Jon Favreau, was contacted by Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy and invited to pitch ideas for a potential new project in the Star Wars universe. Favreau's mind immediately went to Boba Fett, though he wasn't confident that he could just go in and say he wanted to make a Boba Fett TV show, so instead, he pivoted the idea to focus on a new Mandalorian character, one who wouldn't have the same baggage and expectations as Fett himself. After hearing the pitch, Kennedy suggested Favreau get in touch with Dave Filoni, who he'd worked with before on the Clone Wars, as he was also interested in continuing the story of the Mandalorians after Rebels. And together, the two started working on the Baby Yoda show. The Mandalorian Society featured in the show, which was set in the gap between the original trilogy and the sequels, was another step in synthesizing all the versions of Mandalorians that had come before. Beskar regained its indestructible properties, their armor became even more eclectic and personalized, and their society once again became about following a particular creed rather than being from a particular planet, with the title character explicitly being a foundling who was adopted by the Mandalorians during the Clone Wars. The show even went out of its way to use things like Karen Travis's Mandalorian language and confirmed once and for all that Jango Fett was a Mandalorian, though Boba never followed in his father's footsteps, and he ended up finding more kinship with the Tuskens of Tatooine than the Mandalorians. However, despite pivoting much more towards the expanded universe idea of Mandalorians rather than sticking with how George Lucas had envisioned them, the show's creators didn't shy away from adding their own new rule to the society. Mandalorians can't take off their helmets. As Favreau explained in the art book for the show's second season, the decision was made for two reasons. The first was to help establish the Mandalorians as a secretive people, to explain why they seemed to disappear after being so prominent during the Clone Wars. The second was to make them seem more like action figures. Not to sell toys, or not just to sell toys, but because that basic iconography that turned characters into cool action figures was a fundamental appeal of Star Wars. And as the show continued, the helmet rule was eventually tied into wider Mandalorian lore, with the show first implying and then outright stating that the titular Din Djarin's Mandalorian sect was an offshoot of the now well-established Death Watch, which had continued to adopt more and more archaic rules in an attempt to return to the roots of Mandalorian culture. This particular sect, the Children of the Watch, became fairly fleshed out over the course of the series, and continued in the tradition of the ancient Mandalorian Crusaders or Tor Vizsla's Faithful as a very religiously tinted version of a Mandalorian society. Karen Travis had depicted modern Mandalorians as a culture that had a religion, one that placed Mandalorians as soldiers in the eternal war against the god of sloth and stagnation, but they treated their beliefs with skepticism and saw their myths and legends more as allegories than actual historical events. The modern live-action Mandalorians, or at least the Children of the Watch, don't have that same skepticism. While there's no mention of sloth gods, they do believe in prophecies and curses and put a lot of stock into ancient mythological signifiers like the disappearance and possible re-emergence of the mythosaur, something that even starts to get Bo-Katan on board with some of their beliefs. But despite Bo-Katan initially dismissing the Children of the Watch as a cult of religious zealots, she eventually needs them to help reclaim their homeworld after its desolation by the Empire. At the end of the show's first season, it was revealed that the Darksaber was in possession of an Imperial warlord named Moff Gideon, who had perpetrated an event called the Night of 1,000 Tears, and the beginning of a purge against Mandalore, which had already suffered quite a bit during the Clone Wars. And the end of that Clone Wars story was finally told when Season 7 of the Clone Wars premiered in early 2020. This final season, part of which took place concurrently with Revenge of the Sith, featured Bo-Katan Kryze teaming up with Ahsoka Tano to lead a final assault on Mandalore and remove Maul from power. With the help of a battalion of clone troopers, the Mandalorians defeated Maul's loyalists while Ahsoka dealt with the former Sith herself. When the dust settled, Bo-Katan emerged as the planet's leader, and the stage was set for her live-action debut later in the year. In the second season of The Mandalorian, Bo-Katan, along with a pair of other Mandalorians, made an appearance searching for Moff Gideon. And after Gideon stole his little green son, Din Djarin offered his assistance in tracking him down to retrieve the child. When Din and Gideon finally clashed, the Mandalorian defeated the Imperial Moff and took possession of the Darksaber, though he didn't know about the weapon's significance. When he tried to give it back to Bo-Katan, she refused, because the show also added a new rule that the weapon couldn't just be handed over, it had to be won. The contradiction with Rebels was smoothed over during The Book of Boba Fett, which had a couple of Din Djarin-centric episodes that revealed the Children of the Watch believed Bo-Katan's rule was cursed, specifically because she had once accepted the weapon as a gift, and the Empire's desolation of the planet was a consequence of her not claiming the weapon the right way. Then, the third season of The Mandalorian found Bo-Katan all alone. The allies she'd accumulated during her previous outing had abandoned her when she returned to them without the Darksaber, and they became mercenaries. She was eventually able to win them back, though, after she accompanied Din Djarin on a trip to Mandalore and defeated a creature that defeated him, earning the right to carry the Darksaber again. After that, Bo-Katan launched a campaign to reclaim Mandalore after its devastation, and with the help of her own forces, the Children of the Watch, and even a handful of Mandalorians who had survived on the planet itself, they were able to defeat Gideon once and for all and restart the Great Forge at the heart of the planet. And that kind of mirrors the real-world history of the Mandalorians, because Mandalorians aren't just one thing. They're a living, growing society that's been shaped by many different voices and leaders over the decades, and while there are factions of fans who prefer one version over another, the only true version of the Mandalorians is the one that unites them all, with a leader who forges a new path while respecting all that came before. And if you don't like what that leader's doing, I don't know, beat him up and take his sword. This is the way.